We're really delighted to have you at Congregation Sherith Israel this evening for a very special event. I saw my parents earlier today. Thankfully, they were able to get vaccinated. And my dad was reminding me that at my bat mitzvah, Rabbi Weiner, you called popcorn to check the time just before we went upstairs, and we were very punctual. So in honor of punctual Jews among us, there are many. I want to begin our program really on time and honor everybody's time and joining us tonight for this very special program. So I'm going to give people 2 more minutes and then we will begin. Just by way of logistical announcement, the chat tonight, if you are trying to chat, you will only be able to do that to the host, which is Gordon Gladstone. We won't be able to take questions from the audience tonight because we have so many questions and a wonderful program prepared. But if you need to reach Gordon, you can certainly do that through the chat. So I want to welcome everybody to this special evening and thank you to, I see Peter Bonos and Gordon Gladstone who are helping us do everything behind the scenes as they always do. This evening is a celebration of an incredible career in the San Francisco Bay Area and on the national stage. And we are so delighted to be able to honor you, Michael and Leslie, our beloved congregants of decades. I don't even know exactly when you joined Sherith Israel, but we're so pleased that you're ours. In addition to being ours in San Francisco, we're so happy to have you locally. First, I want to begin by introducing a man who needs absolutely no introduction, our interviewer for the evening. We're going to flip the tables on you, Michael, and our interviewer for the evening is going to be Rabbi Marty Weiner, who is, of course, our beloved Rabbi Emeritus. Rabbi Weiner was born in San Francisco and actually attended public school here. He has a long and illustrious academic career, but the important part is that from 1972 to 2003, he was the senior rabbi of Congregation Sherith Israel, at which time he became a rabbi emeritus. It's also very important that in 1987, he officiated at my bat mitzvah. He served as president of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, as a member of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, and in numerous other community and national leadership positions. He currently serves on the board of the Bay Area chapter of the American Jewish Committee and the Gifford Center Against Gun Violence. Rabbi Weiner has been engaged in civic life in San Francisco in every way for decades and decades and decades. And tonight we have the privilege to hear from 2 people with amazing careers that spanned decades and allowed each of these 2 gentlemen to meet with very interesting people and to share their own fascinating lives with us as they continue to lead and to teach us. Tonight, we celebrate, as I said, the career, the retirement after so many years in our San Francisco community of Michael Krasny, who Rabbi Weiner will interview. And we are very honored to be able to honor you, Michael, and Leslie, who I think is sitting by your side as she has for decades. We don't see her on the screen, but I know that she's there with you. We're so pleased that you and Leslie and your family have called Sherith Israel home for so long. By way of formal introduction, I'll say Dr. Michael Krasny is a scholar and professor of English language and literature at San Francisco State University. He has also taught in Jewish studies at the University of San Francisco, as well as at Stanford and the University of California. He is the author of 3 acclaimed books: Off Mic, a memoir of talk radio and literary life; Spiritual Envy, An Agnostic's Quest; and Let There Be Laughter, a treasury of great Jewish humor and what it all means. So since 1993, and what we celebrate particularly tonight, Dr. Krasny served as host of the award-winning Forum program on KQED radio, where he interviewed many of the world's leading political, cultural, literary, science, business, and technology figures, as well as major figures from the world of entertainment. He is the recipient of many awards for his broadcasting, writing, and scholarship, including most recently a Silver Spur Lifetime Achievement Award, the most prominent award for lifetime civic achievement in San Francisco. He has been widely and so importantly a contributor and leader of the Jewish community in many capacities and of the San Francisco community. And we are so happy to have both of you with us tonight for what promises to be a fascinating conversation. So Mazal Tov, Michael, on this wonderful moment in your life as you enjoy your retirement with your beautiful granddaughter in New York, and as you begin to think about what comes next after having completed this incredible, incredible chapter of your professional life in broadcasting. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on the world and your next phase. So welcome and Mazel Tov, and thank you for letting us honor you as you have honored us. Rabbi Weiner?
Jessica, thank you so very much. And it is really a joy and an honor for me to be in this position of interviewing the master interviewer. And I got to tell you, that feels a little scary to me. I would compare it to somebody asking me to deliver a speech after Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt or Abba Eban, but I'm going to try to do what I can. Okay, Michael? And again, my dear friend, it's great to be here with you. Let me begin with a question. I know you're in New York visiting your first grandchild, the adorable Callie Grace. Please tell us a little bit about your family. Let's kick it off with that.
Well, my family now is my wife, my two daughters, and our granddaughter. And Leslie is my wife. As Jessica said, Leslie is quite accomplished. She is, as we had a dinner, and it was nice to have a dinner in New York in friend's apartment just the other night with just about 3 or 4 couples. I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to do this now in a normal way, or what even seems like a quasi-normal way. But this friend of mine said to these people who had never met either one of us, Leslie's the real star of this family, which is true in my judgment. She's recently retired from her law practice. She started a San Francisco law practice with Keller and Heckman, which is a Washington, D.C. based firm, and was a senior partner with that firm. And also before that was a biochemist. Now, since she moved into retirement and I moved into retirement, we're doing things in different ways, like spending a whole month with our new grandchild, who will be a year old, coming up in just a few days. And that's been wonderful. We have 2 daughters who are both bat mitzvahed with Marty Weiner and Cantor Feldman. And one, Lauren, lives in San Francisco. The younger daughter, Alexa, lives here in New York. And it's been thrilling being a grandfather. I feel a little bit aged to be a grandfather. Some of my contemporaries have had many grand progeny at this stage of life, but it certainly never comes too late. And it's been really wonderful.
Well, Michael, let's go back a little bit. You were born in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, and in your book, Open Mic, a memoir of talk radio and the literary life, you shared some memories about being a bit of a wild kid in your younger years. Hard to believe. Tell us a little about your parents and your youthful days.
Well, actually, I was born in Cleveland. I grew up in Cleveland Heights. I was Jewish boy born in St. Luke's Hospital, which is, in the metropolitan area of Cleveland. My parents were essentially what I would describe as ordinary people. They were certainly devoted to family. They were actually devoted to Zionism too. My mother was a very active Zionist, and certainly very much involved in Jewish life and in the synagogue in Cleveland that we belonged to, which was Park Synagogue, a conservative synagogue. I did have kind of I sometimes speak a bit hyperbolic about my Dickensian youth and it was proletarian though. My dad worked in a factory and nevertheless was an educated man who was a bridge champion. My mother was what so many women were at that time, a housewife and a mother. I had a kind of lively phase, especially in my high school years, where I was hanging around with some of the bad boys and certainly wasn't making the kind of impact in any kind of sense that would have, I'll tell you something that happened recently, for example. The Commonwealth Club did a wonderful tribute, and I appreciated that just as much as I appreciate this, to my retiring. And I happened to notice some of the comments on Facebook, and one of them was from a young woman who hadn't followed me since high school and said, "Who would have thought?" Which was kind of funny to read, but nevertheless appropriate. I was academically inclined, and I was somewhat of intellectually inclined and loved poetry, but I was really hanging around with the bad boys. And, you know, some of them really distinguished themselves in that sense, much more than I did. So there were those wild kind of formative years, but, you know, your brain isn't fully developed at that age by a long shot anyway. So there I was as a kind of outlier to who I am now.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, all of us would be interested in the inspiration that brought you to a love of literature and your college and graduate studies.
Well, I became a literature major largely because of some great teachers. I was turned on to Shakespeare by a teacher named Paul Murray Kendall, who some may know. He wrote a famous book called The Art of Biography, and also wrote a book about Richard II. And I thought I was going to be, initially I thought I was going to be a doctor, because that was the one thing my father wanted me to be, and I was interested in psychiatry. But I realized I didn't really have the drive or the motivation to, I think I had a moment with a fetal pig in an anatomy class where I thought, because of the smell of formaldehyde, this is definitely not for me. I became very enamored of literature and wanted to read as much as I could, wanted to study literature. And particularly, as you know, Marty, I was excited by reading Saul Bellow's The Adventures of Augie March and then Herzog. I felt that Bellow was someone who I wanted to know more about, so I actually hitchhiked to Chicago and wanted to meet my idol, and did. Came upon him in surprise as he was coming out of a class. Would have been today as a kind of a stalking incident or something along those lines, but he was very gracious to me. He could be a very difficult character, but he was quite nice to me. And I found myself actually more and more drawn to literary studies, and wanting to read everything I possibly could and wanting to be a novelist. Didn't quite work out that way, but nevertheless, that was what I aspired to. I also had some terrific creative writing and literary teachers. Walter Tevis was one who was a very important mentor. Some of you have seen the wonderful Netflix series, The Queen's Gambit, and that's based on a novel by Walter Tevis, who also wrote The Hustler and The Color of Money and a lot of popular novels that were made into films, The Man Who Fell to the Earth. But he was a wonderful teacher and certainly should have been celebrated as an important novelist more than just a popular novelist that he became. I had a wonderful Jewish professor named Lester Marx, who was a Steinmetz scholar and had a good deal of influence on me. So all of that really conspired to move me more and more into literature. And I found myself drawn not only to fiction, but to other genres, to drama, to poetry. I thought this is what I feel passionate about. This is what I love. Still do.
Michael, just curious, you've mentioned several novels. If you had to share with us, we would love to have maybe your advice about 2 or 3 novels that you think people can't miss, that they should really be into.
That's always a tough one, Marty, to limit it to 2 or 3, but I'll tell you what comes to mind. Malcolm Gladwell says sometimes the things that come to your mind right off the top are those you should give some obedience to or credence to. One of the things that comes right to mind is Proust. And I think there's great value in reading Remembrance of Things Past. And Proust, I remember in the 60s, we used to have these buttons that I like to wear. One said, Proust is a Yenta, which he was. He said, all literature is gossip, and that's not far from the truth. And another one I liked was Kafka was a Kvetch. I was very drawn to those 2 writers. Was it because they were Jewish? Was I drawn to Bellow because he was Jewish? Perhaps, but I was also very drawn to American writers, particularly to Ralph Elliston's Invisible Man, which had an enormous effect on me, and to James Baldwin's work, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and the shorter fiction. But those are novels that I prize and I cherish. Continue to cherish also the novels of Toni Morrison, and certainly the novels of writers like Don DeLillo and John Updike, novelists who I had the great fortune of interviewing. In fact, it became sort of difficult to find novelists of stature, novelists that I had read that I hadn't had the opportunity over this long span in public radio to also interview. But I think that when students say to me, what is a must-read novel? I say, read Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern. It's an 18th century novel. It's very challenging, and it's in some ways hyper-modern in some respects, but certainly worth all the time to put into it. I did a dissertation on a book which is often called a novel, but I don't think it's a novel. It's a book by an African-American writer from the Harlem Renaissance named Jean Toomer. And the title of it is Cane, as in sugar cane, C-A-N-E. And it's what I once described as a lyrical miracle. It's a beautiful written work from 1923, which sold all of 500 copies, but now has become, and I'll take some small amount of credit for this, a kind of classic African-American work of literature.
Michael, thank you so much. What you've done is you've provided summer reading for the next few months for all of our listeners. So if you missed out on any of those, please do follow Michael's advice. Michael, I took your online course in the teaching company, Masterpieces of Short Fiction. If you had to pick a favorite short story or two, what would they be?
It's also hard. You know, it's a challenge for me. It's like those questions, and we may come to this. Who was your best interviewer? Who was your toughest interviewer? Those kinds of things, because there have been so many. And you know, I've done a rather prodigious amount of reading, so it's hard to apply my judgments about what's best. And but if I had to recommend, Marty is talking about something I did for the teaching company called Masterpieces of Short Fiction. It's a couple of volumes, and it was a CD and a DVD, which I really enjoyed doing, because I had to pick out 24 real, what I would call masterpieces. And those stories that come to the fore for me remain, well, for one thing, Vladimir Nabokov said that the greatest story ever told, greatest short story ever written, and this is, you know, sounds like hyperbole, because that's what people say about the Christ story, the greatest story ever told. But I mean that in no irreverent way. It's often applied to the story of Jesus. There's a story by Chekhov, who is one of the great storytellers, of course, called The Lady with the Dog, which is a remarkable story. But I would recommend reading the translation by Constance Garnett, because there are other translations that aren't nearly as good. I think Raymond Carver's Cathedral is a remarkable story. It has a lot to do with imbibing alcohol and cannabis, but it's still, Tobias Wolff said when he first read that story, he felt he was levitating, and that's not far from the effect that story can have on you. There's a story by James Baldwin that I would also single out called Sonny's Blues, which I think is one of the greatest stories in the whole American canon. It's about brothers in Harlem and about addiction. It's a remarkable story. But so many come to mind. I love the work of Jewish writers like Singer and Malamud as storytellers, of James Joyce, especially his early work, and in Dubliners. There's a story by Luigi Pirandello called War, which is an absolutely extraordinary and inimitable story. So I'm sorry, I could go on, but let me just stop there.
Michael, I must admit, I am not your agent, but I would, if people want to have a really great time, taking your course online and the Masterpieces of Short Fiction is really wonderful. So please, I enjoyed it tremendously. Now, tell us, please, Michael, the fascinating story about your eventual leap into a dual career, college professor, talk show host. Please tell us a little about that.
Well, I became a professor and I was kind of antsy, I think is the best way to describe it. I felt like I wanted to do more, and maybe in a public way. And I've been publishing some articles, not only scholarly, but some political articles. And I come out of the ferment of the 1960s and felt maybe I had some things to say. And so I decided to invent myself. Well, first what happened, and Marty, I think you know this story, and it's in off mic. I was asked to do an interview for KQED television with Gore Vidal, and I called it a baptism of fire, mainly because he was intoxicated and anti-Semitic. Otherwise, other delightful experience. But it nevertheless, as unpleasant as it was in many ways, gave me a taste for wanting to do more. And I lived in Marin County, where I've lived for many years, and there was a small station there, a rock station. They called it an alternative rock station. And I went there and said, I'd like to do maybe a program here. A lot of interesting people in Marin County, a lot of people in the rock world, filmmakers and so forth, but also people who are making a difference. And it wasn't just a place of hedonism and hot tubs and the sort of thing that had been at least communicated in a TV show called I Want It All Now about Marin County, which even later on George Bush Sr. alluded to by talking about that place with hot tubs. So I called my program Beyond the Hot Tub, and I wanted to talk about people in Marin County. It was a once a week program. I interviewed a lot of the celebrities in Marin and a lot of people who are doing wonderful work, hospice workers and people who are taking kids out on nature hikes and things that I was curious about and that I thought were elements of good citizenship and all the rest of those kind of things that have to do with public affairs. And then I met Ron Owens, who was we went to a John Anderson rally. There's a name out of the past for many of you. He was a third party candidate for the presidency. And we went to kind of scope him out. Ron said to me, we got acquainted with one another. He said, "Oh, you work in radio?" Yeah. He said, "Well, we got a good first team. We need a bench. We need people, who can fill in." He said, "You mind if I set up something for you and you can bring any recordings of shows you've done?" It just happened in kind of that trajectory. And I brought in an interview I did with a psychiatrist in Marin named Pierre Mornell, who wrote a book called Passive Men, Wild Women, about men who stay home and, women who stay home and watch television and aren't employed. This will date this book, his book. And they're expecting all kinds of intimacy when the husband comes home and talking about feelings and the rest of that sort of thing. The husbands come home and all they want to do is watch a sports event or drink beer and go to sleep. I'm crystallizing and obviously simplifying the thesis of that book, but that was kind of it. And Jerry Johnson, who was then program director at KGO, said, we can give you a shot here. We'll put you on the 1 to 5 morning slot, which was another baptism of fire. You imagine trying to talk to people at 4 o'clock in the morning and get them to call in. It's almost like a bit out of Saturday Night Live, where they're begging people to call in for all kinds of controversies and nobody's calling in. The whole Dan Aykroyd bit. It was a bit like that. And the show was Joe Jasbo Collins' show, who was very popular. Truckers would call in, from everywhere, and when they were on the freeway and whatnot, because the signal was 50,000 watts and went all the way up to Oregon and Washington, even into Canada and down to Mexico. But he would talk about really nothing, and I was trying to talk about news because that was a news talk station. So from there, KGO asked me to do a program on a regular basis on the weekends, and I became a regular talk show host, which was the ABC station and the #1 station in the Bay Area. It was dominant for years. Then I moved to KQED, and I don't take any credit for this, but that became the dominant station, radio station. And I was there for 16 years, for 28 years after being at KGO. That's kind of the whole trajectory.
Yeah. You don't have to be so modest. I think your ratings are legendary, Michael. Michael, I always marveled at the diversity and depth of your knowledge. You're able to discuss politics, medicine, literature, and sports with equal ease. I know that you do extensive preparation for your interviews, and I would gather you're a very voracious reader. But looking back on your many years of interviewing literally thousands of guests, are there some authors, some political figures who especially stand out? And please feel free, we have some time. You can name 4, 5, 6, whatever highlights you'd like to share with us in that vein.
Well, I had the great privilege of interviewing major newsmakers and major figures in political and cultural life. It's always hard to single out. I was just thinking, in fact, this morning of how I was at it long enough and did enough of a eclectic kind of interviewing or versatile interviewing that almost any day in the newspaper, like I read yesterday that Anne Margaret was 80, and that was one of my first interviews on stage for the San Francisco Film Festival after I was moving into, before I was even involved at KGO. And today I noticed Olympia Dukakis died, and I had the privilege of interviewing her when she was working with the American Conservatory Theater. So it's almost impossible sometimes to go through the thicket of all of those people in the news because it's almost an embarrassment, not almost, it is an embarrassment of riches. I can tell you that, you know, I interviewed Jimmy Carter a number of times and Barack Obama, never interviewed a Republican president, though it wasn't without trying. They were, shall we say, less open to public radio or less receptive to being guests on public radio. I would have been glad to interview Trump or Reagan or certainly either of the Bushes. But there are just so many extraordinary people that I had the good fortune of interviewing through the years. And I think about, for example, figures like Carl Sagan, Desmond Tutu, Rosa Parks, the list just goes on and on, Cesar Chavez, and Jerry Garcia, I mean, Grace Slick, Carlos Santana, people in Judy Collins, in almost every bracket that you could possibly think of. And even someone like Isaac Bashevis Singer, who I interviewed on stage and as part of City Arts and Lectures. I'd love to tell the story. It's in my Jewish humor book about when I asked him with great seriousness and solemnity if he believed in free will, and he said, "I have no choice." I mean, there's just so much crystallized in philosophy in that and in the cadence of Jewish humor and all the rest of it. But I've been very lucky, and it goes without saying that just recently, in fact, some of with this Commonwealth Club tribute, some of my producers were challenged with the idea of what do we take cuts from? What do we, the archives aren't as full as they should be because they didn't start until really the late 90s to have the whole thing together the way they should have. But it was pretty challenging. They did a wonderful job, and they had like my interview with Mike Tyson, which was memorable because he came in there and he said, I was expecting somebody like Howard Stern, you know. He said, because you have the biggest ratings. He said, but you're the Kraz. And somehow I became known from that point forward to my staff as the Kraz, because Tyson had dubbed me with that name. So it was quite memorable. Tyson was doing a one-man show at the time, and he had a lot of baggage. You know, he had a lot of moral baggage. He'd been charged with rape, and there were all of those challenging things that I had, as a good journalist, the necessity and imperative of bringing up. And some of the better interviews go to that, in my mind, challenge. One of my earliest interviews was with Robert McNamara, you know, who had been one of the architects of the Vietnam War, which I was passionately opposed to and very strident in my opposition. I thought it was wrong. I still think it was wrong. And here was someone who, you know, could have been labeled a war criminal, but he was trying to kind of clean up his image at the time and so forth. But asking those tough questions has stayed in my mind because I always ruminate about, did I do the job as well as I could have, might have, should have, especially with those kind of difficulties.
You know, Michael, take a couple of minutes because, you know, I could have asked the question, is there anyone you haven't interviewed, which other than Republican presidents? But I would be really curious about some more commentary about things that stand out in terms of what they said to you and what you said to them. I'll give you a minute. I have an I.B. Singer story myself. When we had him at Sherith Israel, he suggested that, I suggested to him that he should read from some of his children's books. So what do I know? And he looked at me and he said, "Rabbi, let the children ask questions. It'll work." And so we did, and it was fascinating. They asked great questions. He gave great answers, this Nobel Prize winner. And I learned a lot from taking his advice. Anyway, please give us a few more of those insights.
Well, let me just actually give you another Singer story, because when I interviewed him, it was not that long after he received the Nobel Prize. And I said to him, naturally, he must have been asked this question. In fact, I said, what did it feel like to be told that you won the Nobel Prize in Literature? And he said, I felt surprised and delighted. He said, and then people continued to ask me, how did you feel about winning the Nobel Prize? And every time I gave the same answer, I felt surprised and delighted. He said, how many times can a man feel surprised and delighted? I have some of what I call, I suppose, war stories.
Love to hear the war stories.
Well, but I have some touching and memorable and poignant stories and so forth. In fact, I wrote that memoir off Mike a little bit too early. People are saying it should have been a sequel, or maybe it should have been written more recently. But there's a story in that book, for example, during the Reagan administration, when I was a KGO at the time, and I felt it was, you probably remember the name, and perhaps many who are in the audience this evening do, Kenneth Edelman, who was a major negotiator in the Bush 1 administration on nuclear issues. And while we were on the air, and it was a telecast, it was being broadcast on Channel 7 as well as on KGO radio. I said to him, it was announced that Dan Quayle had been selected as a running mate for George Bush Sr. And I said, excuse me, and he was called ambassador at the time. Ambassador Edelman, Quayle doesn't seem like a very smart guy to me. I mean, all due respect, he's a senator from Indiana, I know, but he just, and Edelman got really, a little bit up on a high horse. He said, I don't know why you people in the media always cast him as being, stupid or simple or whatever. As he said, he's been doing nuclear negotiations with me and so forth. He's really much smarter than people give him credit for. So we went to a break. During the break, I said, yeah, I'm sorry, but if I came off the way I did about Quayle, but he just doesn't seem like a very bright bulb. Whereupon Ambassador Edelman said to me, blank you. I won't say the word, the F word. And I, as a working class kid from where I came from in Cleveland, immediate knee-jerk response was blank you, back to him, right? And then I see the cameras on and we're on the air again. I said, and so Ambassador, and we're just back to, it tells you something about what can go on behind the scenes and what maybe isn't visible to the audience or audible to the audience. But it's one of those moments that certainly stands out. And I tried in off mic to crystallize a number of those, but there have been so many since. What they did in the Commonwealth Club tribute, I was interviewing Judy Collins, and she started singing the Gypsy Rover. And this has never happened to me before, and I think it will be in the best interest of any public I have in the future that I can say with some vow, it will never happen again, I hope. But I started singing along with her. And just something, inspired me to do that. So I guess I can say to my posterity and to my family, my daughters and my son-in-law and my granddaughter, I actually did a duet with Judy Collins. There are a lot of moments like that that I treasure, and some of them are very funny. I tried in the book on Jewish humor to capture some of those as well, because I try to weave that book in with anecdotal and storytelling of my own. And there were, certainly a lot of stories to tell. I had the, again, advantage of interviewing people like Jackie Mason and Henny Youngman and some of the great Jewish comedians, Gene Wilder. I mean, the list is pretty extensive, actually, through the years. So depends what area we're talking about, Marty, as you know, but there are stories to be told. I know, though, have a deep and profound interest in politics. And there's so much that I've learned through the years from in-depth interviews, from going in, like you said, I certainly tried to do as much homework as possible and to ask questions that I thought would sometimes stir up discomfort, especially of politicians. I had a difficult moment with Carter, in fact. I built up a nice rapport with him, and we had done about 4 interviews. And then on the 5th interview, Alan Dershowitz, who now, of course, has become, well, I have a friend who lives in Martha's Vineyard who says the progressive Jews don't even talk to him anymore because they saw him as being a Trumpist and defending Trump, which I don't think he was, but he was certainly, because of Trump's views on Israel, he was much more sympathetic to Trump perhaps than a lot of Democrats were and a lot of progressives and liberals were. At any rate, Dershowitz had made these indictments about the Carter administration and money that they had given to a Saudi Arabian prince who was known for his, at the time, anti-Semitism and statements about killing Jews and all the rest of it. So I asked Dershowitz, and he was offended that I even brought it up, and it was unfortunate, but I felt it was out there, it was on the internet. He didn't understand why I was bringing it up, but it seemed to me it was because it was out there, it was relevant and important. But I think it made things difficult with Carter from that point forward, unfortunately.
Just a little follow-up, Michael. I'm sure over the years, because Israel and Zionism have been very controversial, any special memories of dealing with that on the air? No matter what you say, someone will be offended. I'm just curious if you have any special memories of that.
Well, Terry Gross, no less, once said to me, it's no win when you talk about Israel and Palestine because the narratives are so at odds. It's true. It's also true if you talk about India and Pakistan, for example. I can tell you this, Marty, that there were some rip-roaring debates, and I would sometimes almost look at a stopwatch and there would be equal time to the Israeli voice and the Palestinian voice. And I would get off the air and I would be called a Zionist stooge and a Palestinian puppet, almost in equal measure. So I felt I was maybe doing things right to some degree. But there was, since you ask about things that come to mind, there was a moment when I had Tony Kushner on. And Tony Kushner, as you know, is a self-declared socialist. I did a few programs with him through the years. And he spoke what I guess now would be kind of J Street talk, sympathy about a 2-state solution, sympathy where the Palestinians were concerned, some anger at the Israelis and human rights violations and so forth. Well, guess who came on after Tony Kushner? Cynthia Ozick. And Cynthia Ozick, I guess, is probably many of you know, is not only an Orthodox Jew, but a very devout and strong Zionist, would be even an understatement. So there were real fireworks. And that's particularly memorable to me because Kushner, on the one hand, talking about much more sympathy to the Palestinians, Cynthia Ozick coming on and expressing her deep and profound sentiments about Zionism. It was extraordinary. It was, that is such lively, vital intensity, but I liked the fact that my listeners were hearing both sides, even though they were both Jewish, of course.
Michael, I'm just curious. So the one area we sort of haven't mentioned, but I know you're up to, you and I have often talked about movies, sports. Any memories there besides Mike Tyson calling you the Kraz?
Well, there are a lot of movie people that I interviewed through the years. I had, I'll tell you a funny moment that happened. I was interviewing Isabella Rossellini, and I got a message from somebody saying, boy, Krasny, this is really tough work for you, isn't it, interviewing Isabella Rossellini? And this exact same thing happened after I interviewed Charlize Theron. I don't know if it was the same person, but somebody came back with that same clip. This is real tough work for you. It was fun interviewing stellar figures like that. And some of them were remarkably fascinating characters in their own right. I heard, for example, that Charlize Theron never wanted anybody to look her in the eye and that she was a prima donna and everything. I talked to her, she was quite amicable and looked her right in the eye and made eye contact with her. There was no problem with that. So you hear these stories about people that, when you meet them in the flesh, and they're on their best behavior often when they're on the air with you. But I really, interviewed the great directors, and most of them. And I can tell you that Coppola was really someone who I was fascinated and loved the opportunity to talk to on a couple of occasions. He's warm, just like you'd expect. He has great stories to tell. I got to know Barry Levinson and interviewed him on a couple of occasions. He lived in fact, in Ross in Marin County. And so we got sort of friendly and had a brief interview with DiCaprio, who some people may not know is a major environmentalist and had some, I thought, really reasonably thoughtful and brilliant things to say about environmental issues. I mean, it's just a whole list of people in the film world. And like you, I have always had a strong interest in that world. And the film critics, even the ones I've disagreed with zealously. I know we both, I mean, I happen to be fond of Mick LaSalle, but we both find ourselves often in disagreement with him.
Yes, we do.
I kind of have to take responsibility for launching Mick into media. He did his first talk show with me. But, you know, Roger Ebert and, you know, some of those, Sheila Benson, those major names in film criticism, Pauline Kael, I had the privilege of interviewing. In sports, I was telling a story at this dinner party the other night. There's a guy had a Yankees hat on. He's a big Yankees fan. And I said, well, you know, I interviewed Mickey Mantle, because I did. And all my kind of friends and colleagues who were from New York heard about it ahead of time. And all they wanted to do was to meet the Mick, to just be in his presence. You know, sports heroes have that kind of luster. I mean, it was that way when I interviewed Joe Montana and Steve Young and figures like that in our own backyard sports world. When I had some of the World Series giants on, it was a great thrill for me and so many of the people on my team to meet them, and Bochy. But there was something particularly about Mantle that all these New York boys who grew up with that slugger and that remarkable center fielder. But I think they, like me, they were kind of disappointed because I hope I'm not telling a story out of school here to some extent, but Mickey Mantle was more, and this is before the Me Too movement, obviously, demonstrably licentious than almost anybody I'd ever seen when we were off the air. A newswoman would walk by or a news anchor would walk by, and this good old boy, which he was from Oklahoma, that Jim Bolton writes about, this has been written about in books like that, about all the licentiousness and lasciviousness of ball players. And there it was for all these boyhood fans of his to see.
Well, thank you. Michael, let's, we'll shift just a little bit. We cannot forget your book on Jewish humor, Let There Be Laughter, a treasury of Jewish humor and what it all means. Some of the listeners today may have also heard your fascinating lectures on the subject of Jewish humor. I can't resist mentioning that I recently sent you two what I thought were amusing stories that I found delightful. Of course, you already knew the jokes. Please share with us some of your thoughts about the essence of Jewish humor.
Well, that was what I try to pretty much center on in that book. What I said is the essence of Jewish humor. You keep hearing this cliche, it's all about suffering and it's all about, you know, trying to find an anodyne to all that Jews have been through the ages and thousands of years. And there's some truth to that, although there's even a joke about that, you know. All Jewish humor is based on suffering. If I hear that one more time, I'm going to kill myself. But I started exploring it in many different ways and realized there's a lot more to it, obviously, than that. And I wanted to find what strands I could and make sense out of it. And it's also a great deal about difference, about Jews seeing themselves as being different in so many ways, and using that as a source of amusement and sometimes hilarity. A lot of it has to do with different cadences and things that come out of the mostly Ashkenazi Yiddishkeit experience, but difference, particularly in terms of American Jewish humor. And that difference often has to do with loss and loss of identity and loss of assimilation, moving from orthodoxy to in so many instances, reform or secularism. So many jokes are really anchored there, but they're also anchored in stereotypes. And I realized, I didn't, as someone who thought of myself as a feminist, I understood the concern about so-called Jewish American princess jokes because they're based on stereotypes. But then I realized there's another side of them. And that side was they're celebrating the success of patriarchy and Jewish men who, in many instances, did very well and did well by their daughters and their families. And I began to realize that a lot of the jokes were based on stereotypes, unfortunately. There's that old Woody Allen line about, he shows this beautiful gold watch and he said, yeah, I love this watch. My grandfather, sold it to me on his deathbed. This is a joke that still has a kind of resonance to it. But, when you really kind of deconstruct it, you realize there's a deep kind of stereotype at the heart of it about the rapaciousness and sort of stereotype of Jews where money is concerned. So I went into those stereotypes and I went into the brighter side and the more affirmative and celebratory side of Jewish humor in the book. But a lot of Jewish humor is rooted in what I would call, what many think of as Jewish character. The whole first chapter, for example, is devoted to Jewish mothers and Jewish grandmothers. And, now we talk about tiger mothers and helicopter mothers and so forth, but Jewish mothers had a kind of archetypal nature that was part of our zeitgeist, call it the spirit of the times, of particularly the contemporary period, because so many Jewish male writers particularly memorialized that figure. Sophie Portnoy and Portnoy's Complaint, How to Be a Jewish Mother by Dan Greenberg, all these books and all the movies that created, if anything, just different versions of those stereotypes were pretty preeminent. So I wanted to get at, what is there about those stories about Jewish mothers? What do they tell us and so forth? And I'll tell you, for example, one joke, which is a favorite joke of many people, but it communicates so many volumes about Jewish mothers and so forth. So there's a man who's dying, he's on his deathbed. And his daughter is by his side holding his hand. And everybody knows the shade's about to come down, his time is limited. And he smells kugel, and he can barely even get the words out. Some of you know this joke, I'm sure. And he says, kugel, I smell kugel. And his daughter says, Mom is making a kugel. He said, to taste kugel once before I die. I know I'm going to die soon, just to taste your mother's kugel. She says, of course, Daddy. And she gets up and she's gone, and he's hanging on by gossamer threads. He's barely even able to be alive. Finally, she comes back and holds her hands. He says, where's the kugel? Mom says it's for the Shiva. Or another version of that is, Mom says it's for after. All right, so in some ways, it's kind of a mean-spirited joke, right? But why do we laugh? We laugh because we think about Jewish mothers being practical. We think about Jewish mothers having to carry on after their husbands die. We think about all of those things that go away from the stereotypes in some ways to how Jewish women had to essentially take care of things often, especially in the shtetl, where their Luftmenschen, their husbands were studying Talmud and Torah all the time, and they had to take charge of everything. Anyway, that was a kind of more feminist interpretation of those kind of jokes.
Yeah, Michael, I would recommend to folks, if they haven't read Let There Be Laughter, they should. You can tell by the jokes that Michael is sharing. I cannot help in a synagogue setting, cannot resist bringing back another very intriguing book, Spiritual Envy and Agnostic's Quest. Of course, you and Leslie, as Rabbi Graf has mentioned, have been devoted members of our Sherith Israel Synagogue for, I checked, 37 years. You've even served on the Board of Trustees. I remember saying to you over the years in our friendship that there are scholars who would maintain that Maimonides was in essence an agnostic. And I did kid you a bit about your ending to the book, your strong spiritual feeling about saying Kaddish for your father. So please share just some thoughts about Judaism and religion, all on one foot, okay, please.
Well, some thoughts are that Philip Roth, who's getting a lot of attention now because of this Blake Bailey biography, said there should be a distinction between Judaism and Jewishness, and I agree with that. Judaism is the religion, the theology, the practice. Judaism is more the heritage, the tradition, the rituals, and often they meld and they combine and they synthesize. But I found myself wondering about God and just what role the divine had, if any, in my life. I didn't know if I was an agnostic, but I knew that there wasn't a lot. And like you, I thought Maimonides was an agnostic in many respects. And the Jewish tradition puts a great deal of primacy on the importance of not only study and serious study, but questioning and skepticism and intellectual pursuit of meaning, which is what Midrash is, which is what my literary studies have all been about my whole adult life, and scholarship or news analysis is about, and I do that. And so I thought, can I apply some of my analytical skills to trying to understand what I believe? And agnosticism wasn't a word that felt comfortable to me. It still doesn't in some ways. I mean, there's that old joke about a family of agnostics move into a neighborhood and their neighbors burn a question mark on their lawn. You know, it was actually, I think, a Mark Saul joke. You know, I wanted, in fact, to be a believer, and I thought, I didn't like the atheists. I interviewed them all: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, who I loved interviewing, by the way, who was a real intellect to grapple with. But I thought they were too easy in their condemnation of religion. I thought religion gave people solace, it gave people hope, it provided, in many respects, a way of comfort. And there were people who did things for religion that were very humane and selfless and wonderful. And I wanted to make that brief at the same time that I thought, of course, religion has caused a lot of destruction and a lot of pain and enmity and division in the world and wars and so forth. So the book was an attempt to take on those big questions and the question of what I believed. And I found myself going into a lot of different areas in that book. And ultimately coming up with a sense of not knowing what to believe, but wanting to think of myself as a searcher, as someone who would continue in a quest, but who felt moments of a numinousness, that's a good word, or moments of transcendence, moments of a kind of spiritual, what I was in something called the Cantor's Club as a boy, before I went off and started hanging around with the bad boys. I did a pretty mean shacharit and not a bad musaf, actually. I would get there in my blue robe and lead the services. And I loved it. I loved using my voice. I didn't know it would lead to a broadcast career in some ways, but the trajectory was there. Child father to the man. And there was something imbued in me about maybe no accident that I married someone who had strong cantorial roots in her family tree. I impressed Leslie's maternal grandfather, who was a cantor, when I started letting him know, when she brought me home for one Pesach before we were married, that I knew a lot of the melodies and knew a lot of the liturgy and prayers and sang them. So I hear cantorial music and get a feeling that is in some ways beyond language. It's ineffable. My father used to say to me and my brother, "You will say my Kaddish." Unfortunately, he didn't say it to our sister, who just passed away recently, but one didn't say that at the time to daughters. And as a father of daughters, I'm delighted and happy to be the father of daughters, and it's a different world, and I'm happy of that too. But back in the day, one son said Kaddish for them, and so it was very meaningful to me to say the Kaddish, which is really just praise of God. It's a sanctification of God. It's not, a lot of people think of it as a kind of mourner's prayer, which of course it is, but at the same time, it's an affirmation of belief. And I, to this day, am not certain that I can say with any certainty what I believe. I know I believe in at least aspiring to be a mensch, a decent human being, a loving father and husband and citizen, a good citizen. I mean, those are things that I value and cherish. To make a contribution in whatever way I can. Sal Bello turned me on because he said, what does it mean to be a good, he said man, unfortunately, but what does it mean to be a good person? How does one define that? and I'm still, a work in progress. But I think Judaism has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, Michael, I think everybody can just sense by what you've just shared with us the depth of your struggle and search and the honesty of that search, which has always been part of a loving friendship I've felt toward you. I must confess, though, saying that you had a mean Musaf, that's a new phrase, which I love. That you could
What phrase? I'm sorry, Marty.
You could do a mean Musaf.
Oh, Musaf, yeah.
I love that one. Let me just kind of one more question. With all your years as a college professor, I know our listeners would welcome your thoughts on some of the critical issues confronting higher education today. Maybe a comment or two about the emphasis today on technology and science at the expense of humanities.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And also thank you for all your thoughtfulness, Marty. You've said some lovely and generous and really wonderful things about me. And I could go on for far more time than we have saying similar things about you, because not only have we had a friendship that I cherish, but you've been a major figure in my family history. And you are, I'm proud to say, and remain proud to say, just as Jessica is my rabbi, and I cherish that and value that greatly. Well, I'm concerned, I don't mind telling you, about all the emphasis on STEM. I think a lot of parents I can understand feeling that way. They want a practical education for their children. Parents will come to me and say, hey, my kid's a creative writing major or lit major. What's he or she going to do? What are they going to do? Maybe sometimes they like to use the third person plural now to be politically correct. And it's a tough question, especially for those of us who teach in the humanities. There's been probably an overemphasis on STEM, but we live in a technological age, and we live in an age where the internet is taken over and the digital world is taken over, and we're moving into artificial intelligence in ways that boggle the mind, and biotechnology and all the rest of it. I think what disturbs me, though, is, and I come out of, the anti-Vietnam War and civil rights tradition of student radicalism myself, but, and there's still students that I think are wonderfully committed to social change and justice, social and otherwise, environmentalism. But what I've seen in the woke movement bothers me. And it bothers me because you see in San Francisco, for example, the attempt to kind of erase history in some ways and say there shouldn't be a Dianne Feinstein school with her name because there was a Confederate flag, and or there shouldn't be, they said it shouldn't be a school named Paul Revere. I still don't understand. I think they were reading Google the wrong way or something. Can we just forget about our history? Can we forget, Jefferson was a slave owner. He also wrote the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln did terrible things to Indians and also tried to set up a colony in Liberia of slaves, but he also wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the slaves. I mean, history is a very difficult, nightmarish, complex thing. And what bothers me now about this as a teacher of literature, I teach Flannery O'Connor and I read articles saying she uses the N-word, she shouldn't be taught. Twain uses the N-word, right? I have students who say, why are we learning to read and study Shakespeare? Patriarchy, white privilege, these kinds of things. You cannot erase history, and you shouldn't erase history. You need to look at history critically. And it's disturbing to me because it's gone into areas that I think are well-meaning in some instances, but are extreme. And I also am disturbed by the fact that there are some students who still love to read and still love to study history and literature and the humanities and science in the better sense, both biological and physical. But there's too much now of, I don't know, I'm sounding like I'm whining here and I don't want to get into this kvetchy sound here at all, but there really is too much emphasis on reading things that are abbreviated. Students will read text, they'll read Facebook pages, they'll read emails and so forth. I'd like them to go back to reading novels and struggling with novels the way I did. It's not one of these things where I'm saying you should go through what I went through, because I read a lot of novels and that's made me a better person or anything like that. I'm saying there's great value in reading omnivorously and reading voraciously and not just reading small miniature things that come online in text messages or whatever. There's a lot less of that kind of fiber and drive, and it bothers me. I mean, I've been in teaching long enough to see the students that are the most responsive are becoming a kind of select group as far as literary studies is concerned. And it used to be that students would study literature just because they love literature. It's not that practical for them in the economy we live in now.
Um, Michael, let me give you just kind of one final question, and just asking you in a way to be a prophet. Based on your years of interviews with movers and shakers, would you like to share just briefly some thoughts about the challenge that is in our minds right now? Namely, what do you think the world will be like post-pandemic, which we're approaching? Any thoughts about that?
Some thoughts, no crystal ball, unfortunately, no way of prognosticating or channeling the future. I think it's going to. I think it's going to be difficult because we don't know what's up ahead. We don't know about the variants. We don't know if we're going to need boosters all the time, like the flu. There's still so many unanswered questions out of this plague that we're in, and there's been a lot of harm. You know, students have stayed out of school. There's been a loss of a year in many instances, or certainly close to that, and so forth. And there are going to be repercussions and consequences to that, and we're going to have to settle that up and find out what it all means. One of the things that disturbs me is now that we're coming out of quarantine. I mean, it's a time to rejoice, but at the same time, we're seeing these uh, killings taking place more. And you know, before the quarantine, there were student shootings, and then everybody went into quarantine, and they were quiescent for a while. Are we going back? Are we regressing? How are we going to unify really this country? We had 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump. And, you know, this is not to go against, there are many people here tonight who may have voted, uh, voted for Donald Trump. There are many people here tonight who may have voted for Donald Trump and may find Joe Biden disturbing in ways that have to do with different kinds of political equity. I just wish there were the standards now that I used to live under, where you always tried to hear both sides and certainly made every measure you possibly could to hear both sides. We're so polarized now. I don't know how we're going to move on an equal plane or on a plane that can bring us together and unify. And we have many of the same challenges. I like to talk a little more hopefully, but I think we're going to continue to have an ongoing crisis with immigration. It's pretty plain and pretty clear to us. Um, it's not going to go away. I'm not sure the Democrats know what to do any more than, I hope they're not going to put people in cages or anything like that, obviously, but it's an ongoing, serious, and maybe intractable dilemma. Um, and I don't know, in economic terms, we're rebounding now tremendously, but we're spending a lot of money that's allowing for that rebound. And we're going to have to pay the piper. That's why I understand where some people feel some skepticism about this administration and concern about it. Some people are very happy. I think probably the majority of Jews, I'm not talking about Orthodox Jews here because they were mainly Trump supporters. The majority of Jews, especially in San Francisco, were probably very happy that Joe Biden is president. And I think he's, in his State of the Union speech, he outlined some really wonderful things about family aid and about stimulation to the economy and stimulus packages and so forth. We'll see what he can get through Congress. A lot of good things, though, are happening and a lot of things to be positive about. But we have many of the same problems. And the big one for me remains guns, immigration, unity, and how to unify. And like God and all of that, I don't have answers. But I know we're going to go through rough times because we've always been through rough times.
Michael, may I thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing your spirit and maybe a bit of your soul. I learned some things that I thought I knew out of our friendship, but I must confess this has been a very special evening, and I want to turn it, well, first of all, thank you again, just very, very sincerely, and also turn it back to Jessica and thank her for being the person who put the two of us together for the congregation. So sending lots of love to you and your family, and especially to Callie, okay?
Thank you, Marty, and love to your family. And let me thank you and Jessica also for this lovely honor this evening from the bottom of my heart. And I just hope everybody will go forward with with more of a positive spirit than maybe this somewhat less sanguine note that I've ended on here tonight. But that's in the spirit of being Jewish as well. So
Exactly.
Well, that's why we always end with Havdalah, so we have a beautiful opportunity to head with hope into a new week. But before that, I want to thank you both, as we're thanking so much for this wonderful conversation. Marty, you so beautifully interviewed the master interviewer. So thank you for allowing us to hear stories from behind the scenes. I very often say that one of my favorite things about being part of Congregation Sherith Israel is the fascinating collection of people that we have. It's really people who have been movers and shakers and masters in so many different arenas. And I feel that so profoundly tonight, Michael, as we get to hear about your life in the broadcasting world and in the world of culture and intellectual life in San Francisco over these many years. You've given us a window into the behind the scenes of what goes on. And I love your story about the F word when the microphone was off just for a couple of minutes there, things that we would never have known about from the polished, shiny outside as an audience. From your illustrious and amazing career, you have shared so much with us. And I think what I love the most, I've heard you speak many times, and especially tonight, I feel like your career allowed people to be interviewed and be heard always through your lens. And of course, journalists are impartial. Journalists are available to really bring all the words of different sides, as you mentioned in some of your remarks. But I think that everything that you do, Michael, has such a powerful connection to Judaism, to intellectualism, and to humor. And clearly your work over all these decades, your commitment to community, your love of family, your love of San Francisco, of culture, and of the Jewish community in particular really comes through that lens, and we are so grateful to you. So Mazel Tov, and thank you for all that you've done and given us, and for this honor tonight, you spending this evening with us. We're really pleased.
thank you both.
And it's my privilege to introduce Cantor Toby Glazer. Many of you know our Cantor. I was going to say new Cantor. He's not going to be a new Cantor for much longer, but as soon as you guys all get to meet him in person, he will immediately cease to be our new Cantor. Some of you I know are fans of Michael Krasny from outside our congregation, and so you may be meeting Cantor Glazer for the first time. And we will end tonight, as Michael, as you said, kind of with this intellectual struggle that's in all of our hearts. That is something about being Jewish, certainly. We will end with hope for a new week and heading into the beginning of a new opportunity. When we look at the light of the Havdalah candle, we reflect that light in our fingers and remember that it is in fact our hands that in the next 6 days and in the weeks beyond will continue to build the world that we want to live in. So we enter with much hope and also with an appreciation for the honesty of the struggle. Cantor, would you explain a little bit just about the blessings and lead us in Havdalah?
Talk about a tough act to follow, and thank you so much. It was such a pleasure hearing all these wonderful stories. I've darkened the room a little bit. It's not quite dark outside yet, but I thought that we could fake it a little. So we are going to basically go through our blessings, separating Shabbat from the rest of the week. I'm going to sing an extended chant at the start. I'm very glad that you mentioned your connection to cantorial music because I didn't know if I was taking too much time, but I think this is a fitting tribute that we can offer a little chazanut, a little chazonos before we sing our blessings. So I will light the Havdalah candle and then we will commence our blessings. Okay, almost there. We take our cup of wine and we sing. Hine el Yeshuati eftach velo evchad Ki ozi v'zimratia Adonai vayahi li lishua ושבתם מים בששון ממעייני הישועה לאדוני הישועה לעמך ברכתך סלה אדוני צבאות עמנו משגב לנו אלוהי יעקב סלה אדוני צבאות אשרי אדם בוטח בך אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו ויום קוראנו ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה וששון ויקר כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועות עשה ובשם אדוני אקרא. And we come first to our wine blessing and we sing Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Borei peri hagafen Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yada dai 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 yada dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yada dai 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 yada dai 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 dai. We come now to our blessing for fire and we see our fingers reflected in the flames. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei meorei ha'esh Borei meorei ha'esh Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yada dai 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 yada dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yai dai 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 Yada dai 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 yada dai 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. We take our spices and we sniff them to restore our souls after Shabbat, after we lose that special second soul we receive on Shabbat. Borei minei v'samim, borei minei v'samim. Yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai. Yada dai 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 dai, yada dai 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 dai. Yai dai 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 dai, yai dai 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 dai. Yada die 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 die. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol. We sip our wine and extinguish our flame in the cup, and we sing Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol. Yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 dai. We continue. Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol chadotenu yimchol zarenu v'chaspenu yarbe kachol v'chakochavim balayla. Shavua tov, 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 Shavua tov. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbir, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Bimheira veyamenu, Yavo Eleinu, Im Mashiach ben David, Im Mashiach ben David, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, everyone, to a wonderful, wonderful week ahead and new opportunities to build our world. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Good night.
Good night. Shavua Tov.